Hi, y'all. There's Monica again.
Hi, everybody.
Let's see. Change my.
Everybody's in.
Look, hi. Some of you, we just saw each other and I love it. I get to see you again for a minute. So, thank you and welcome again to FoxTale Bookshop. And tonight we have two authors. We have Susie Schnall and we have Elise Hooper. And you will recognize them, if you don't already, by some of their other titles. Susie's latest title is We Came Here to Shine. Thank you for holding it up. And her other work has been Subway Girls, Balance Project, and On Grace. So we've had all of those books at FoxTale, and so I'm sure that you've got your readers here. And we also want to introduce Elise Hooper. Elise is in Seattle, and her latest is Fast Girls, which is about the 1936 Olympic team. And she had two others, I think, Elise, before that. What she's most known for, at least around our circle, is the other Alcott. And so we're delighted to hear all about her research into the 1936 Olympics. And so y'all, you can ask questions. As you know, in the chat screen, we will look at those and Gary will ask the authors. And at the end, we will unmute everyone so you can say hello and goodbye to the authors. But for now, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. And oh, y'all look at the really cool way the books are colored behind Susie's head here. We've been talking about bookshelves, and then Elise's bookshelves has all kinds of treasures I just want to get in and see. So I'm going to turn it over, Susie, if you would start for us, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you, Gary, for inviting Elise and me. We are very excited. This is we have several events planned together, but this is the first one we're doing to kick it off. Elise and I met, I don't know, within the past year, when we both realized that there was a lot of overlaps with our books. They were coming out right around the same time, and we thought it would be fun to take our show on the road as our topics complement each other. So here we are, and we're so glad all of you have tuned in. Thank you so much, and we are excited to tell you about our books. So Elise, why don't you start by telling everybody a little bit about Fast Girls?
All right, thank you. So great to be here. Thanks so much for having us both. There we go. So Fast Girls is a novel that really follows these three Olympians: Betty Robinson, who's on your farthest left, Louise Stokes in the middle, and Helen Stevens on the right. These three women all came from very different backgrounds, and you know, women were not allowed to compete in the Olympics. Well, starting in the first modern Olympics in 1896, they were allowed to compete, but in what were called aesthetic-only events, and that included like your golf and tennis and things like that. So running wasn't introduced to the Olympics for women until 1928. And Betty there on the far left is one of our first women Olympic track stars, and she won a gold that year in Amsterdam in 1928. Louise comes in, she'll head to 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, and then Helen Stevens enters the mix for 1936, and all three of these women come together to race in Hitler's 1936 Berlin Games, kind of under a lot of pressure from both their own country and the Berlin of the 1930s and the pressures from Hitler and his Nationalist Socialist Party. So it is historical fiction, just like Susie's. I will say that Susie and I have a couple oh wait, no, sorry, I made a mistake there. We have, oh, forget it. I think somehow, oh no, there we go. I just messed up my order, but we have a couple of characters in common. We have, I've got Betty there with Johnny Weissmuller. Is it Johnny Weissmuller? Is that how I say it, Susie?
I think so.
And then he's there with Eleanor Holm on the left. It's funny because Susie in her book launch mentioned how Johnny would like pull down Eleanor's bathing suit. Is that right? When they
Esther Williams, but
oh, Esther Williams. Okay, well, it's funny. When I heard that, I made a note because Johnny had been he was also from Chicago, like Betty Robinson, and Betty's family had sort of entrusted Betty's care to him. To Johnny. And so I've always, when you told me that, or when you said that, Susie, I thought, oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, you don't want to entrust your daughter to Johnny Weissmuller.
To the best of my knowledge, nothing sketchy happened, but.
But they didn't talk about it back then because it was just normal.
That is very true.
So, okay, so We Came Here to Shine is uplifting historical fiction. And I think what Elise and I both have in common is our historical fiction novels are not about wars, which is really nice. So if you're interested in historical fiction around the middle of the century and you don't want to read about a war, we've got the books for you. But it's uplifting historical fiction that's set at the 1939 New York World's Fair. And it focuses on two main characters, Vivi, who is a gorgeous Hollywood actress who in the first chapter is about to start day one filming in her very first starring role in a Hollywood movie when the studio head plucks her off of the set and sends her to New York to star in the Aquacade, which was a synchronized swimming spectacular. And that is the last place that Vivi wants to be because she feels that it's going to jeopardize her acting career. At the same time, we have another character named Max, and Max is a plucky journalism student at NYU, and she is selected to be in this very prestigious cohort of students that gets placements for their summer internships. And all Max wants is to be placed at the New York Times so that she can write real news, but instead her professor decides to put her to work at the newspaper, the daily newspaper at the New York World's Fair. Max is a person who hates fairs and hates carnivals, and it's the last place that she wants to be. So both of these two women are in jobs, the last place they are wanting to spend their summers, but it turns out they end up meeting, they end up pursuing their personal and professional dreams, and it becomes a summer that they never forget. And the third character is the fair itself, and I take the reader behind the scenes of the extraordinary and iconic World's Fair of 1939. So now we're going to talk about what inspired us to write the books that we've written. So Elise, what inspired you?
Oh yeah, well this one, I was actually working on a different novel that I just, for whatever reason, wasn't really feeling the chemistry with. And my younger daughter, who was in 4th grade at the time, had to do a biography project for her library class. And she picked Gertrude Ederle. Now, I know, Susie, you know who Ederle was, but she is not very well known today, but she was a real celebrity of the 1920s. She was a 1924 Olympian, a swimmer who won several medals, and then she was the first woman to swim the English Channel. And she came home feted as America's sort of next best thing. President Wilson called her America's best girl. And yeah, she was a really big deal. Yeah, I had never heard of her. Here I played sports my entire life, knew nothing about her. So the project really got me thinking about other pioneering women athletes. And so I started digging around. And when I found these stories about Betty and Louise and Helen and the rest of really the crew, the women from this era that's really 1928 to 1936, because then the Olympics take a few years off because of the world wars. This just felt like a fascinating time, and these women really blazed the way for the rest of us. If you like to go out for runs or you ever go to the gym or something, we really have these pioneers to thank for this. So I immediately knew this was my next story and was just so captivated, and it has just been such a great adventure. They're very inspiring women, each in their own way, so it's been a really fun one.
Awesome. And I got the idea for We Came Here to Shine by reading Esther Williams' autobiography, which is called The $1 Million Mermaid. And this is a story about Esther Williams, who many of you may know, who was a very famous swimmer and a star in all the Busby Berkeley musicals. But when she was 19 years old, I'm reading this and I'm getting to the part where she's 19 years old. She's working at a department store in Los Angeles, and she's invited by a man named Billy Rose to audition for his aquacade. And she ends up getting the job and swimming in the aquacade at the 1940 Golden Gate Exposition in San Francisco. So I'm reading this and I'm like, I don't know what an aquacade is. So I went to Google and I looked up aquacade and found out that the aquacade, Billy Rose's aquacade, to be specific, Billy Rose was a very famous Hollywood producer who was married, for those of you who know the name, he was married to Fanny Brice for a while, and eventually was married to Eleanor Holm, who was in that picture that Elise just showed. But Billy Rose's aquacade started at the 1937 Cleveland, Ohio World's Fair, and it moved to New York in 1939 and was the highest grossing attraction at the 1939 New York World's Fair. So I started doing all of this research into the aquacade and found it fascinating. It led me to the 1939 fair, which I also started investigating and found that fascinating. And I ended up going down a rabbit hole and realizing that if I stuck a character, if I made a synchronized swimmer character and put her in the 1939 World's Fairs in the aquacade, that would make a really fun premise for a novel. And then I had to come up with my second character. I needed somebody to I could juxtapose with Vivi, my swimmer. And I had been doing a lot of research about female journalists because I was going to write, it's a long story, but I was interested in women in journalism. I had read this book, which I highly recommend, Lynn Povich's The Good Girls Revolt. And some of you may know the show Good Girls Revolt, which was on Amazon Prime. It only lasted one season. I'm sorry, Debbie, that's very funny how you just showed up in your screen. But so I learned a lot about women in journalism, and I thought that it would be great to make my second character a journalist, because with journalism, not only did I get to explore what it was like to be a female journalist at the time, when most female journalists were either foreign correspondents or did undercover things like Nellie Bly, and it also gave me a vehicle by which to put articles into the book in a way that would make sense. So that is how I got the idea for We Came Here to Shine.
It's funny too, Eleanor Holm even had a stint as a reporter, our aquacade star. She did. When she got kicked out off the 1936 Olympic team on her way to Berlin by Avery Brundage because she was drinking on the boat, and despite the fact that all the men were walking around with like flasks in their waistband and stuff, Eleanor got thrown off the team despite being quite the champ. But she kind of got the ultimate revenge by showing up in Berlin anyway with a press pass, and she kind of tortured all of the Olympic officials by the fact that she was now reporting on the team. So
right. I had heard that. And so for those of you who are wondering what we're talking about Eleanor Holm in this 1936 Olympics. In 1937, she starred in the first Billy Rose aquacade in Cleveland. And then she was the star called Aquabelle #1 in both the 1939 and 1940 aquacade in New York. The conceit of my novel is that Eleanor Holm hurts her leg or hurts her foot, I don't even remember at this point, in the aquacade, which is why they need to replace her, and that's how my character Vivi gets the starring role. And just a side note, in the 1940 aquacade, Johnny Weissmuller, who had been in 1939 with Eleanor Holm, he moved to San Francisco to star with Esther Williams, and Buster Crabbe, for those of you who know him, he starred in the 1940 New York show. So now that we're talking about all this fascinating research, Elise, what sort of research did you have to do to learn all these interesting things about these ladies? Because what I think is interesting is that, and what I think people should know is that you follow them through the different, and each Olympics is different and what happens to them. And so it's like a culmination when you get to 1936, you're so invested in these characters. So how did you learn all of that about them?
Right. Well, I really had my work cut out for me here with writing about 3 such different Olympics. So first of all, there's just Olympic research I had to do, especially around 1936. There's so much drama around Hitler's games, but 1928 and 1932 are also really interesting in their own way. 32, of course, is in Los Angeles during the Great Depression, so that added a lot of pressure in. And then 28, I mean, it's so different from the Olympics that we experience today, where all these athletes arrived in 1928 off the boat from the US, only to find that like none of the facilities were ready, the pools were leaking, it was raining all the time, there were cows walking around on the track. It was not the slick production that you see today.
Where was 28? Sorry to interrupt.
That was 28.
Where
And then,
was it?
in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And so really, actually, the fact that we see these very slick, highly produced Olympics today is because of Hitler in 1936. He really created, those games were really his sort of propaganda machine. So the torch relay, all these things we know and sort of love about the Olympics today, much of it has its roots in Nazi sort of propaganda.
Wow.
So there was all this Olympic history I had to figure out. And then there was also these women, and you know, women, boy, just reading newspaper articles, every article, their name is spelled differently. I mean, women were just playing not even second or third fiddle. They were like the 25th fiddle out there. No one was really paying much attention to them. And so I really had to, I read all these biographies and nonfiction pieces about all these different women. They produced oral histories, some of them that reside in this foundation in Los Angeles that's dedicated to the Olympics. I talked to some of their family members. I went to their hometowns. Helen Stevens' biographer was a great help, and she invited me to come out to Missouri. I visited the Helen Stevens papers in Missouri and got to hold her track shoes and see her handwritten diary from the Berlin Games. So it was, I mean, I even actually went out to Malden, Massachusetts and found the old railroad tracks where Louise Stokes had trained outside of Boston, and they're now pretty much paved over in like a strip mall parking lot. But it felt really important to me to see some of these things firsthand and to talk in a few cases to some people who knew these women, because their history is really spotty. They were not as documented as the men. So a fair amount of stealth work, and a lot of librarians and archivists came to the rescue. I worked with an archivist at Northwestern to piece together some stuff about Betty, and I was getting like yearbook pages emailed to me by these amazing librarians and historians. So it really was a team effort. I'm really grateful. I don't know what historical fiction novelists, writers did before the internet, because I relied on it so heavily to see some of these films of women running, the whole thing. It was, as I said earlier, it was a full adventure. How about you, Susie?
That's so interesting because obviously your book, it's historical fiction, but it's based on 3 real women, which I think is interesting because you have to be somewhat careful. And I'd love to hear later what you had to be careful of in terms of getting your facts straight. I don't really know how that works, but my characters were fake, so I got to make them up. And obviously Vivi was somewhat based on Esther Williams' experiences, but in no way based on Esther Williams' life. So I started my research basically the same way. I read a ton of books about the World's Fair, and I scoured old newspapers through the Times archive, which is amazing. It's called the Times Machine, and it's like every New York Times paper going back to the 1800s. I was able to watch newsreels on YouTube of the World's Fair. A man named Philip Medicus, I think it was 17 reels he made. And so you can watch, I just watch people walk, and there's no sound, and or maybe there's music to it, but, and you just get to watch all of the different exhibitions and pavilions, and it's just really interesting. And what else did I do? I bought a ton of souvenirs off of eBay. Including some costume jewelry and a bunch of postcards, some that had been filled out. So I got to read what people were writing to their cousins back in Arkansas. I bought a ton of, as I showed you before, that picture of Gertrude Ederle was in this. This is an actual Aquacade program from the Billy Rose's Aquacade. And then one of the greatest things I was able to find on eBay were these copies of Today at the Fair. And this is the actual newspaper that I have my character Max working at. It was an 8-page tabloid size, 5 cents a copy on the grounds of the fair, or you could order a monthly subscription that would be sent to your home wherever it was that you lived in the country. And so being able to just read through this and see how they covered the news of the fair, what they covered, the voice that they used, it was just a really, really cool thing. And then one of the most interesting things I got to do was actually go to the site of the World's Fair. So the World's Fair, for those of you who didn't know, it was held in Flushing Meadows, Corona, Queens, which is right near LaGuardia Airport, right near Citi Field where the Mets play, and near the Billie Jean King, why am I blanking on her? Billie Jean King Tennis Center where the US Open is played. And so the grounds are there. It held the 39-40 fair, it held the 64-65 fair. So there are a few remnants from the 64-65 fair, but other than that, it's a park and a museum. And so I was able to go on a tour and walk the paths that my characters would have walked because the footprint of the fairgrounds are still there. So that was really, really cool. And I loved doing the research, right? It just sucks you in. And it's so funny because somebody asked me on one of my talks, like, how did you choose to do historical fiction when you have to do so much research? And my reply was, I get to do so much research. And that's kind of my favorite part of writing these types of books. And I did it, my last book, The Subway Girls, is about the Miss Subways contest in New York City. But I think if you're somebody, like, I don't think you would go into historical fiction writing if you didn't like the research, because if you're not willing to take the time, then your book is going to be inaccurate and people are going to question whether they can believe what you've written. So I think that that's something that Elise and I both paid great attention to make sure that they were accurate and reliable. So do you want to talk a little bit more about the history of the Olympics? I mean, it's so interesting because this is an Olympic summer, which, as we all know, Tokyo is not happening. And there was also supposed to be Dubai Expo Dubai 2020. There's now a World's Exposition. It's called Exposition around the world. It's called a World's Fair in the US. Every 5 years, the BIE, which is the governing organization, throws a World's Fair. It was supposed to be in Dubai, but that's been delayed. So Lisa and I were launching our books during a World's Fair summer and Olympic summer, and those aren't happening. So now you get our books instead. But I know you referenced a little bit of the history, but any more to share?
Well, I mean, I was absolutely planning to ride the coattails of this summer's Olympic Games. Yes, Dawn, thank you. I mean, weren't we all? Part of the reason this book felt so appealing to me was because I am a huge Olympics fan. When I was about 6, saw Peggy Fleming's in the Ice Capades in Boston, and just that changed my life. I wanted to be a figure skater, and I did end up competitively figure skating until I was about 12. And I have all kinds of old fan mail to various Olympians over the years. So I have really been looking forward to these games. And I think what's really interesting is that women's performances in the Olympics have just gotten better and better and better. And in Rio, of course, American women especially dominated. I mean, much of that has been credited to so many opportunities since the passage of Title IX. But this is definitely, it's interesting. I mean, the fact that now this Olympics is postponed, hopefully not canceled, is throwing a monkey wrench in so many Olympians' lives. And, you know, at first, I think when it got canceled, well, first of all, I was following the news so closely about this. And I guess I kind of felt like a lot of these Olympians were still kind of had their secret ways to train and stuff, but that's really not the case. I mean, everyone from Simone Biles, I mean, they're all just sort of stuck in their living room and figuring out workouts on their own. And my daughter, who's the swimmer, who inspired, who introduced me to Gertrude Ederle, I have watched her do like 3 hours of different workouts every day, trying to stay fit, and she is nowhere near the Olympics. But so I really, as much as it's been disappointing for me not to have these Olympics to focus on, I really am just so amazed at kind of how life is changing for all of these Olympians, especially with women's sports. So in the news right now with pay equity, benefits, coaching opportunities, all of these different things we're talking about, this Olympics was going to offer such a great showcase for women to be able to show how well they're competing and what a force they are. So I don't know. I mean, the best I could say is that this book will give you a little bit of Olympic flavor this summer, a summer where we have lost. I mean, I'm a huge tennis fan. I wanted Wimbledon, all of these things that we're missing out. Hopefully you'll be able to get your sports fix through Fast Girls. I've written a few different articles, both for Lit Hub and Refinery 29, of various reading lists for sports fans, ways you can get your athletic fix while we're being kind of grounded currently.
So sad. Were you supposed to go to Tokyo this summer?
Well, I definitely had dreams of it at one point. I had ended up in February
Right.
instead going on a research trip for the book I'm currently working on about some American nurses in the Philippines during World War II. And so I was in Asia for 2 weeks in February, which was, in retrospect, such a crazy time to be there. I did end up spending 24 hours in Tokyo. And I mean, I stood next to their little countdown clock. And I mean, no one was on the streets in Tokyo, which, you know, something's weird when that's the case. So I kind of had a pretty strong feeling that the Olympics were something was going to happen. I was pretty sure they weren't going to take place in Tokyo this summer. And Susie, you were supposed to go for your
I'm supposed to
birthday.
leave Friday. Yeah, I'm supposed to go Friday to Japan for 2 weeks, but it's fine. It's not happening. It'll happen. Japan will still be there for my next birthday. But yeah, we weren't going to go to the Olympics though. We were going before the Olympics. But anyway,
Yeah.
I have some interesting history just to give you a very, very brief orientation of the 1939 World's Fair. And because I just want to give you some visuals. So this is a postcard, one of those vintage postcards I have of the 1939 World's Fair. And the idea started in 1935 when an engineer approached Grover Whalen, who ended up being the president of the fair committee, with the idea to have a World's Fair as a way to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression. And so it ended up that a committee was formed, and they chose this site, which was, as I said, Flushing Meadows, Corona, Queens. It was an ash heap, and this was chosen to be the site of the World's Fair. And so for the next, they broke ground in 1936. And for the next 3 years, they worked on the construction, and this was the final product. It was 1,200 acres, which, to give you a little bit of context, Disney World, Magic Kingdom down in Orlando is about 500 acres, 400 or 500 acres. So this is almost 3 times the size of that. And it was comprised of hundreds of buildings, and it cost $160 million of investment to make, which is about $3 billion in today's money. And it was the largest, most expensive World's Fair ever put on. And I wish I could just point you out to all of these amazing things, but this is FDR, who who opened the fair on April 30th, 1939. You can see Eleanor down there to the right. She's the only woman in this crowd behind him. And this day of opening the fair coincided with the 150th anniversary of the inauguration of George Washington, and that was on purpose. Just to give you a scope of the fair, this is a map that was included for free in New Yorker magazine, and I actually have a copy of this that I also bought on eBay. But it just shows you the scope of the fair. And what they did, which was revolutionary for the time, is they created zones for this fair. They wanted it to be navigable for the visitors. And so they created 7 zones and what they called the theme center. And this is just a quick slide that shows the different zones. So on the top left was the theme center, which were the 2 architectural icons of the fair, the Trilon and the Perisphere. Then we had the government zone, which had about 60 different countries, and except for Germany, they didn't have a pavilion, but Russia, USSR had the biggest pavilion. About 60 different countries and about 30 different states. There was a community interest zone, and this little picture shows you they had a city of a little town of model homes, about 15 model homes that showed you different building materials. The communications zone, and that is a picture of the administration building, which is where my character Max works on her newspaper. Bottom left is the food zone, and there were different companies such as Heinz 57, and that's that building. The production zone that was that was Westinghouse's time capsule, which is fascinating, and I could get into that, but that's in the book. Transportation zone, this is a picture of Ford's test driving ramp. And the amusement zone, which held amusements, including the Billy Rose Aquacade, which is the image that you see there on the bottom right. This is a picture of the Aquacade. It held 10,000 people. It was a huge, huge production, 10,000 people. They did about 4 shows a day. The pool in the middle and the stage behind and in front, with 2 diving towers on either side, which held diving platforms, as well as a glee club on one side and an orchestra on the other. And there were costumes and props, and it was just really an extravaganza. And then these are 2 copies of Today at the Fair, which is what I showed you, where my character Max works. And that's all. So that's just a little brief taste of the history of the fair, which I could definitely go into, and we'll be doing so in some of my other talks. But it's just so much fun to talk about, right? I mean, the history is so intriguing. So did you find out anything, Elise, interesting that you didn't think you'd find out during your research?
I mean, I learned interesting things at every turn that I didn't expect. The biggest thing really for me was that I hadn't realized there was such a boycott movement leading into the 1936 games. I really hadn't realized how participating in those Olympics was not a sure thing at all. As Hitler was really taking control of Germany, all American diplomats in Berlin were advising against participating. But FDR, who we just saw pictured, wanted his war reparation payments from World War I, so he didn't want to antagonize Hitler. And so despite all of the advice he was getting from his experts, he did end up sending a team, but that boycott movement only lost by a couple of votes. So it was really a fraught period, largely because of the politics, but also there was so much at stake. You know, Hitler had his own ideas, obviously, about racial supremacy, but a lot of those ideas were happening here too. And so there were a number of Black athletes. I guess there were about 20 that went to the 1936 Olympics. 2 ended up being sent home for rather mysterious circumstances described as homesickness, but a lot of historians have some various theories on that. The 18 who remained, there were 2 women. Louise was one of them. I think I have some pictures here. And while we all know well, here I go. I do need to show this picture of Helen with Adolf Hitler, of course. He was dying to meet Helen. He considered her the perfect example of Aryan supremacy, and even goes as far as to invite her for a weekend away, which she denied, partly because she had a race to run. But a lot of these athletes, so there we have Helen again with Jesse Owens. And Jesse Owens is, of course, the most famous Olympian probably from those 1936 games. He won 4 gold medals, which was just a feat of absolutely a phenomenal feat. And he really had got so much press as a result of this. And yet there were these 18 other Black athletes who remained in Berlin. Only 2 had been sent home. And these men, only Tidy gets to actually compete of the women. But the men, these men, I think won about 15 medals overall. And that's a quarter of the medals that were won by Americans in those Olympics. And that's actually out of the team of 300 athletes, even over 300. I think it was about 350. And so really these 18 athletes have such an enormous contribution to the success by America in those Olympics. And yet it's really only Jesse we know about. I think most newspapers at the time, of course, did not want to be reporting about Black athletes. And so Jesse was kind of the one that they decided to report on. And so he gets great credit, which as he should, of course. But these other athletes were incredibly successful as well. I mean, we have Mack Robinson over there on the far right. He was Jackie Robinson, sorry, his older brother. Many of these men went on to become engineers and politicians. Tidy became the principal of a school named after her in Chicago. Louise, although she doesn't get to compete in these games, again, because of some racial discrimination and sexism, she goes on to create a league for women, colored women's bowlers, is what they called it at the time. So all of these athletes were so accomplished, and yet we don't know anything about them. So I was just blown away by the success of this group, and yet I had never heard anything about them. And really, that's kind of the theme, honestly, of this whole book, is these women and these men who really did achieve amazing things, especially all the forces that were working against them, not only in Germany, but they really needed to prove themselves in their own country as well. Many of the women, something that was working against them was coverage in the newspapers. No one wanted to see pictures of tired looking girls in the newspapers, is what they said at the time. And so I wrote a lot of newspapers, like Susie mentions in her book. I too wrote a lot of newspaper stories to capture that tone, that really gossipy tone, the sexism. I mean, sometimes these reporters would describe one of the athletes by saying, like, the buxom gal in lane 3 had an exceptional showing. I mean, they kind of treated them all like, honestly, like racehorses. They were not taken seriously. They weren't reported on very well. In a few cases, especially in 1928, in those first Olympics in the story, some women are tired at the end of their race, as one would be after racing an 800. And yet, because of that, the men there all were sort of appalled that these women were so tired, and they decided to pull all distance events really beyond the 100. There was the 200 too for a little bit, but those races don't return to the Olympics until 1960. So a lot of these changes really take a long time to overcome. The first women's marathon doesn't happen until 1984. So things took a long time as far as parity. And I mean, there still aren't an equal number of events open to women in the current Olympics than there are for men. So there's still a lot of room to go in these, but really, surprises at every turn. I mean, I'm sure, Susie, you can relate. That's part of when you talk about the charm of doing the research. What I think is so fun about historical fiction is how much I get to learn while I'm working on it.
I know, it is so much fun. And I mean, you were just talking, and I was like, how am I going to pick something that was I mean, I think obviously finding out that there was a real newspaper at the fair, I was shocked, and it kind of made my story work a little bit better. I didn't have to make up a newspaper, but there's so many exhibitions at the fair that I found fascinating. I'll just tell you quickly about the Westinghouse time capsule, which was filled and buried in 1938, and it was displayed at the World's Fair in 1939 and 1940. They also made one for 64 and 65, and those two time capsules are now buried in the same I don't even know what you call it, memorial cement thing in Flushing Meadows. What did you say?
A bunker?
Like a memorial, but something to celebrate, like a relic. I don't know. Anyway, you can go and you can see them being buried, but they're not meant to be open for 5,000 years, which is like the craziest thing. But it was filled with 100 articles that were meant to represent life in America in 1939. Everything from Mickey Mouse ears to a safety razor to a deck of cards to cigarettes. I think it was 1 million pages of documents, everything from a speech by Albert Einstein, just a ton of different things, which is fascinating. It was one of the most popular attractions at the fair. But I could go on, and I think maybe we'll see, are there any questions before we have more to talk about, but before we take up all that time with our story?
Sure.
Anybody have questions?
Sure, there's a few questions we can ask. I think you've covered a lot of it, but Dawn wanted to know who does the fact checking besides you, and did the publishers go behind you to check? I think you pretty much have already indicated you both did your own research. You didn't have research assistants, but does the publisher?
So I do all my own research to figure these things out, but during publishing, there is a process where they do check some of that stuff. I'm trying to think, often it kind of happens during copy editing, during that phase. And I have learned so many interesting things sometimes of catches my copy editors have made. When I wrote The Other Alcott, I remember describing that they drank out of champagne flutes. And my copy editor came back, she was like, nope, not flutes at the time. They would have used coupes. And I was like, okay. So you never know. With that said, there are always things that are missed. And in fact, I probably get an email about once every 3 weeks about learning to see from sharp-eyed viewers who at one point they are pledging allegiance, and I describe them pledging allegiance, and part of the pledge isn't added till a little bit later. And so people of a certain vintage know that because they remember having to relearn the Pledge of Allegiance. And it was something that we caught like 2 weeks before the book's pub date. So you can't change, you can change it in the Kindle and like the ebook or whatever, but definitely the first edition has that error in it.
What was left out or what was added?
Well, I mean, I can look, but
no, it's okay. I just thought it was something that
I think that was the reference to God, actually.
I was going to ask, was it the under God?
Yeah, and I wish I could off the top of my head. I mean, honestly, I get emailed so much about it, I should know.
That's okay.
The date that it happens, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it was the God part.
Huh. And yeah, I do all my own research too. I always hear about authors that have research assistants, and I think that sounds so fancy, but I get that, you know, sometimes the research is so extreme and deep, and that in order for them to keep up on their deadline, they hire research assistants. And I think I might like that job, because that's my favorite part. So if anybody needs a research assistant, call me.
I know. When I was working, the book that never came to fruition that Fast Girls kind of detoured me from was a book I would have needed to hire someone at Yale University to go through. It would have honestly been cheaper for me to hire someone to do a lot of photocopying for me and stuff of objects that could not leave the library at Yale. There are, you know, grad students and stuff you can pay like $8 or $9, now it's probably more, but at the time it was like $9 an hour to do just, you know, a scanning and stuff. That's the closest I've ever come to that. But I do feel like sometimes with these nonfiction books, yeah, when I'm reading the acknowledgements at the end, they list off like an army's worth of researchers. And I'm not really sure how that works, but I would love to.
And I don't know who pays those research assistants. I mean, anyway, I think for fiction, we have to do a lot more stuff on our own than nonfiction writers. But yeah, and mine also, the same as Elise, it went through a copy edit, went through a fact check in the copy edit, and certain things that were caught. For instance, there's a lot of discrepancy among the theme center. Like they were called zones, and was the theme center included in the zones? Were there 8 zones or were there 7 zones? And to be honest, in all of the books, and even in the guidebook that I owned, I bought the actual 1939 guidebook off of eBay. You can see that the spine is cracked. It's different everywhere you look. So we kind of gathered information and went with the best thing. And sometimes I noted at the back of the book, there's a pretty robust historical note. And for instance, the Trilon, which was that big triangular building in the theme center, that's listed everywhere as 700 feet. But in a few places, it says that it ended up being 610 feet because of budget constraints and time constraints, that they didn't get all 700 feet. So it's listed both ways. Same thing with the number of countries that participated and the number of states that participated. And I think part of the challenge is that the fair changed so much from 1939 to 1940. And I only focused on 1939, but you really have to know which year you're studying, because the fair was only supposed to be the summer of 1939, and they had anticipated 50,000 visitors, 50 million visitors for that whole summer. But it ended up that they were projecting that based on the attendees, they were only going to get to 25 million visitors. And so the concessionaires and other exhibitors were saying, you need to do right by us, extend the fair by a year so that we can recoup our investments. And so they extended the fair for another year, April to October of 1940, but they only got another 18 million guests. So a lot of those numbers, and we just kind of went with the most popular answer and noted if it was necessary. But yeah, I think though that especially for this type of historical fiction, you're, as Elise said, it's a copy editor. It's not a research professional. And I don't know at what point, and every publishing house will be totally different. I don't know at what point they employ or source out that sort of research. And I bet it depends on the topic. And I know now, at least for certain topics, they're going to be a lot more careful. And that, goes to sensitivity readers as well. There are sensitivity readers. So for instance, if anybody read Small Great Things by Jodi Picoult, one of her characters is an African-American nurse. And she had a sensitivity reader because Jodi Picoult does not have the experience of an African-American nurse. And she wanted to make sure, and that's an unbelievable book. She wanted to make sure that she was not doing an injustice to that character. So yeah.
And actually, along that note, I used one. I had what they call now authenticity readers for Fast Girls because of my character, Louise Stokes. I wanted to be alerted to any race issues, and there are also a lot of issues around LGBTQ rights in my book. So I just wanted as many diverse readers as I could get early on in the process.
And did you have to hire those people, or did your editor find them within the house?
My publisher hired them.
Okay.
So, and then I also had some friends who I was able to use too. So I had a couple different rounds of that. Because yeah, you don't want to make mistakes at all. I mean,
and did they come back with advice of things you should change?
Absolutely.
So interesting.
Yeah, no, it is so helpful. And I would never, I would advise writers to use them because it's a really important step. And, you know, I feel like I am really cautious and sensitive to these things, but yeah, there are always things to be learned. So, I mean, especially just even with things changing right now, people are now using an uppercase B in Black. In my book, it's lowercase, and we debated it. And, you know, a year ago, it was lowercase. So, or, you know, now I guess we could have changed it a few months ago. I don't know. It'll be curious if we now change that in the future editions.
Thank you, Dawn. Great question.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say you answered Dawn's question. I forgot you guys can see the questions as well.
No, I just know
you
Dawn.
can't.
I can see Dawn. She has a nice smile.
So a couple of other questions before we wrap up. I will say that all of your books for both of you are available at FoxTale via our online store or by giving us a call at the shop. And we are big historical fiction fans at FoxTale, so they definitely fit right in there in our sweet spot. Let's see. Dawn there's two other questions. Becky wanted to know what's the strangest thing you found out about while researching for both of you.
Okay.
You said fascinating things, but this is like the weirdest thing.
Well, I have kind of a sad thing that happened. One of the women in my book, Stella Walsh, who also she had both a dual citizenship. Well, not dual. She ends up going with a Polish citizenship, but she has the opportunity to pick. And she was a real outsider her whole life. She grew up in Cleveland, ends up, eventually the US kind of refuses to sponsor her. And so Poland wants a champion because she was setting world records. So they basically offer her citizenship. And she had grown up in sort of Polish family, so it wasn't a big stretch. But she never, then she didn't really fit into Poland either because she was American. So she really led this life of always being sort of in between cultures. She was a real loner. All the different women described her as always doing her own thing. She never hung out in the locker room. She always left right away. Well, as it turned out, she was shot in a convenience store parking lot in the 80s. And the autopsy revealed she was intersex. And so, I mean, I just think that's such a tragic thing now that we know, but that no one understood at the time. When this was discovered, people wanted to she had won the gold medal in the 1932 Olympics. They wanted to take it from her legacy. So I mean, I knew it from the beginning of doing this research. Information is now on the public record, but that just broke my heart the whole time I was working on the story, that she was so misunderstood throughout her own life. She even gets married at one point, hoping to reclaim back her American citizenship, and she doesn't make the team that year. But she was competing for decades. She was such a committed athlete. And just the fact that then her legacy becomes so cast into shadow, I think is a real tragedy.
So interesting. I am going to tell you a story of Dr. Cooney's baby incubators. And I just pulled up a picture while Elise was talking, so I'm going to share my screen real quickly. Where did it go?
There it is.
Yeah, we're looking at it.
Okay, so these are Dr. Cooney's baby incubators. Dr. Cooney was neither a doctor nor was his name Cooney, but he was trained in taking care of preemie babies in Europe, and then he came to America. And at the time, there were no NICUs. There was nothing like that. There were no incubators that were used in hospitals. If you had a premature baby born, you went home with that baby, and oftentimes the babies died. And Dr. Cooney created this, it was a sideshow essentially in the way that that term was used. He set up these NICUs, essentially, these premature baby hospitals in fairs and eventually at Coney Island, and he would take care of premature babies at no cost to the families. He would charge admission, and you can see there a woman behind kind of like the railings staring at the babies. He hired nurses 24/7, wet nurses and other nurses to care for the babies, and they survived. And there is a fascinating book by Don Raffel about Dr. Cooney's baby incubators, and there are reunions of the babies he saved. And he saved so many babies, and it's just a fascinating thing. And Dr. Cooney and his baby incubators do show up in We Came Here to Shine. So if you want to find out more about them, you're going to have to read my book.
Great. Let's see. Real briefly, and then we'll wrap it up here, is Dawn also had another question. She wants to know, how do you organize your bookshelves?
We were just talking about that before we started our sort of official call. I have a lot of bookshelves. So the one you see behind me here is kind of filled with a lot of my research books and everything. So I kind of do it by topic. Downstairs, we have a lot of bookshelves that I do more by author. I would love to do a more like the rainbow organization, but I already know that would drive me nuts because I would have trouble finding things. I don't always remember the color of the spine of a book, and yet I can usually remember the author. So as it is, though, my family knows I get somewhat crabby when people do go putting books just willy-nilly around, and I can't find them. But no one really touches this bookshelf, only me.
Not okay to take a book out and return it non-alphabetically. That's not okay.
Just somewhere random, yeah.
So this is my office, and this shelf behind me are like books I've loved that I've read recently, and then some classics, and those are in color coordinated because I loved the pictures of people doing that and wanted to do it. But as you can see, I'm going to lift my screen up a little bit. That next shelf are like books that are waiting to be read, and then I have a pile. You can kind of see it right here. I'm on a mirrored screen, so I can't point normally. Right there, that's a stack of books. I have books waiting to, oh no, maybe it's, I don't know. It's right here. So I have stacks of books waiting to be read everywhere. And then downstairs in my husband's office is where I keep like all of my novels, and those are alphabetical. And then I have a history section. So it's done by subject and by author. I'm very particular about that.
Wow.
And I don't like to give my books away. I know some people say give them to other people so they can enjoy them, but to me, it's very personal. I feel very strongly about my books, and even if I'm never going to read them again, it just makes me happy to know that they're there.
That's funny. You know, my husband made me for my birthday a few years ago one of those little free libraries that's out in front of our house. Aww. And you know, I have two girls who have grown a lot in the last few years, and so when we kind of outgrow books or whatever, and we have a bunch of kids in the neighborhood, especially who are a little younger than my kids. Our little free library gets a lot of action, which is really fun.
That's cool. Yeah,
how often do you go? Way to move books along that, you know, need a new life.
And do people leave other books for you to?
Yes, I love seeing it's really fun to track what kind of comes and goes, for sure. What gets right up, what sits around a little longer. I put a lot of galleys I get out in the little free library, and then all my neighbors feel very like dialed in that they're reading books ahead of time.
Yes. Well, one question that often comes up is, who else do y'all like to read? What other authors, Elise, do you like to read?
Oh boy, I read a lot of different books. I just download, and I always have an audiobook going. I usually have an ebook going so I can read in the middle of the night and not wake anyone up. And I always have paper books going. I will say, I just got this Real Men Knit. I'm an avid knitter, and I love the cover, and I'm really all about uplifting books right now, and so I'm super excited to read that one. I just downloaded on Libro FM. Oh yeah, you've got it too.
I got
Nice.
it today. Yeah.
Nice. I got the Jane Austen Society book by Natalie Jenner. So, and then, you know, I always have a few nonfiction books going too that I'm working on. This is a group of essays that is amazing. Impossible Owl, so good. I mean, the voice in these essays is fantastic. So I always have kind of a lot going on. I think, you know, I have trouble focusing sometimes on one book. Thank you.
Yeah, I love answering that question. I just finished listening to White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which I highly recommend. Eye-opening, and I loved it so much. And because I couldn't get a hard copy of it, so I listened to it, but I just ordered a hard copy too, so I could take notes in it. And I also just finished listening to Untamed by Glennon Doyle, and got a hard copy because I need to take notes. This is kind of like, she's my god, and I love her whole approach to life, and so that resonated with me. And my next two books up include A Galley by Jane Healy, who wrote the Beantown Girls, for those who read that. But did you get that, Galley, too?
Yeah.
It's called Secret Stealers, and it sounds so good. So I'm going to read that, and then I cannot wait to read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which I saw today. She got she's #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, which is so cool. So I have so many books. I mean, I don't really know how to manage that side of my life because there's just too many. I mean, I'm sure all y'all there are book lovers too, so it's hard to, and then you find that there are books that you've been wanting to read that just keep getting, oh, I'll read that next, and then next thing you know, they're sitting on a shelf with like 50 other books that you aren't sure you're ever going to get to.
Yeah. It's a real problem.
A delicious problem to have.
Yeah.
Gary, are there any other questions?
Nope, we've covered everyone's questions.
Is there anything, Susie or Elise, we haven't covered that you would like to share?
I'm just going to share one quick thing, which is that I really wanted to include a map in my book to orient the readers while they were reading, and all of the maps that existed were too busy or I couldn't get the license to. And so I commissioned an artist to illustrate a map that's included in the book. And it was such an incredible process. I have the whole story about how we worked together on my website at susieschnall.com. But it highlights like the 10 or 12 different buildings that my characters actually go to in the book, so that you, while you're reading, you can kind of say, oh, well, they were there and they were there, and this is where that was in relation to the rest of the fair. So, and there's other pictures in my book too. So there you go. Thank you for asking.
Great.
Susie and I have talked about that map because I love books with maps in them, like Circe. And I mean, as soon as a book has a map, I am going to read that book. And my new book that'll be about the Philippines, I think a lot of people here in this country don't really understand the geography of the Philippines. And so I think a map might be in my future for that.
I have a map designer for you.
I know, I've encountered a few. It's talk about another good problem to have, is like figuring out your map designer.
Right.
Well, I know that I can't wait to dive into both of these, and I know that everybody else feels that way. I could listen to both of you all night. Just so much information, so much fun information, and I know that my readers here will agree with me. And we do have them available at the shop. But mostly, Elise and Susie, I just want to thank you for the amount of time and the devotion that you both put into your books, and that it's your passion. And I'm so glad that you are highlighting women that we wouldn't have known anything about. And so now we're going to unmute everyone so they can say hello and goodbye. But thank you, all of you.
Thank you. I was going to say too, I have book plates I can always send that can go into books.
Please,
So
Yes.
if you want them, I can send some to the shop, or readers feel free to anytime send me a message and I can mail them to you.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah, and thank you guys, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, obviously, for having us, Gary and Karen. This was such a treat. It was so much fun, and Elise and I are going to be doing more events together. But it's fun to talk to you all. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's great. It's great to see people.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Well, y'all have an open invitation to FoxTale anytime.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
answering all my questions.
Oh, anytime, Dawn.
Questions are the best part. I love the questions. In fact, I have nothing to do, so I could sit here and answer questions for another hour. Have my wine. Poor Elise, it's 4:30, Elise. You're close
Is it
to
now
half an hour.
4:30? My family's fired me from making dinners because my dinners have gotten so bad, which is truly the best thing to ever happen. I find it funny that they all like think they're punishing me.
a pizza cat book.
I'm like pretending I'm sad about it, but so,
Well,
thank
thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. You guys were great.
Thank you.
Thank you, and best of luck with both books. Elise's comes out next week,
July 7th.
July 7th. Okay. And Susie's book is out now. It came out last week.
Yes.
So we're going to let you all go. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, but thank you so much, and I hope we get to meet in person one day, too.
For sure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.